Stargate, a novel by Dean Devlin and Roland Emmerich. Chapter 3. Los Angeles, present day. Soaked from head to toe, toting an overstuffed book sack and muttering to himself, Daniel Jackson slogged north along Gower toward Sunset Boulevard. He was a clean-cut man with sandy brown hair and a fair complexion, just shy of 30 years old. He had forgotten his umbrella and didn't have enough money for the bus. His shoes looked like hand-me-downs, but the long cashmere trench coat he was wearing gave an air of respectability. As he walked, he seemed to be lashing out at some invisible enemies. In fact, Daniel had to ask himself whether he was really going over the edge this time. What was supposed to have been his day of renewal, his reacceptance into the academic community, felt instead like his entombment day. Turning west on Sunset, he entered the little grocery near the corner, hoping Mr. Arzumanian would let him put a bottle of wine on his tab. He figured that if it was his burial day, he might as well get embalmed. "Mr. Dan, my friend, what's happened?" boomed Arzumanian, burly and habitually enthusiastic. "Amen echat ahavorar, nranchar haskunum, yes anchar kaletsi em." Daniel summarized the nightmare in fluent Armenian. "So I was hoping to get a bottle of wine, but I don't know when I'll be able to pay you back." "I got idea. Yes, Kolkin," replied the shopkeeper, offering a trade. He needed Daniel to translate a negotiation between himself and one of his suppliers who spoke only Greek. He wanted to make the call right away, but when he saw the pain on Daniel's face, he suggested they put it off until the next day instead. With the bottle of booze completing his look, Daniel stepped back into the rain and headed for home, wondering how he'd ended up like this. Wasn't he the boy who had won the scholarships in high school for his translations of Phoenician poetry, then had been accepted at UCLA when he was only 16? The young wizard with the triple major in languages, philology, and ancient history? How had he let so much promise slip through his fingers to end up a scorned, dead-broke, friendless, lonely, unemployed, and very wet ex-professor? He remembered that disturbing statistic about the percentage of boy genius types suffering from early insanity. Daniel knew he was in a bad way. He splashed his way across the parking lot of Tkachenko's Tires, a seedy garage in a crumbling brick building. He saw the owner, Vladimir Tkachenko, shaking his balding head in disgust from under a Lexus he had up on the hydraulic lift. Daniel lived in the converted office space above the garage, and several months behind in his rent had already been served his eviction notice. Unless his luck changed pretty soon, he would have to start calling everyone he knew, asking if he could sleep on their floor for a few nights. He walked right past Vladimir and up to the shop's grimy business counter. "Any mail for me?" Sitting at the desk, laughing into the telephone, was the prettiest girl Daniel knew, Svetlana. When she saw who was asking, all the joy went out of her expression. Without interrupting her conversation, she stood up and dropped 2 pieces of mail on the counter. A few months earlier, before his grant money was gone, things had been different between them. They had joked and flirted, and even gone around the corner for Thai food a couple of times. But just when things were starting to warm up between them, he'd run out of funds and had turned into the problem tenant. He inspected that day's correspondence, a final warning from the phone company, and another missing children card, which Daniel studied just in case. Daniel, even more deflated than he was before, walked out of the garage and sat down in the drizzling rain on a stack of spent radials, staring into space. Across the street, a filthy homeless man was lecturing a cat about not digging in the garbage only 10 feet from where a tough-looking chauffeur was guarding his sleek limousine. What a messed-up city. His mind began replaying the conference and the disastrous speech he had given that afternoon to the nation's top archaeologists. Most of them knew him by reputation and thought he was slightly demented, a victim of too many science fiction novels. Unfortunately, today's events had only reinforced their opinions. The articles he had published over the last year or so had been greeted with universal scorn by the academic community. Even though his research methods and the depth of his information were still admired, the conclusions he was drawing from the evidence were increasingly different. He was rocking the boat, and his colleagues attacked him savagely in the professional journals. "Ignores long-established facts," was a typical comment. Some of them went beyond criticism into personal attacks. "Jackson is either misguided and incompetent, or he is engaging in substance abuse." Or the one he had clipped out and taped to the kitchen wall. "This is the sort of archaeology we expect to find in the National Enquirer. His work has no place in the world of respectable science." Daniel was fully aware of how unconventional his conclusions were. That's why he had hedged at first, publishing a very watered-down version of what he really believed. But he was convinced that his theories conformed to the facts better than the time-honored explanations of early Egyptian civilization. When he had walked into the giant Scottish Rite Temple on Wilshire Boulevard that morning, he knew he would be facing a skeptical audience. But he hadn't expected them to be hostile and downright insulting. Dr. Ajami, his department chair when he taught at Columbia, had flown out to participate in the conference. When none of the event's organizers wanted to introduce Daniel, Ajami stepped forward and gave Daniel a glowing introduction. "He graduated with his master's at the age of 20, speaks 11 different languages, and I fully expect his dissertation to become the standard reference of the early development of Egyptian hieroglyphics. He has written several seminal articles on the comparative linguistics of the Afro-Asiatic language groups, and, of course, on the development of the Egyptian language from the Archaic period to the Old Kingdom, which will be his topic today. Please welcome one of Egyptology's most promising young scholars, Daniel Jackson." As he was making his way to the podium during the introduction, he overheard a pair of aging professors enjoying the following conversation. Daniel recognized them as two of the dinosaurs of American archaeology. "Ah, another wunderkind," blustered the pudgy Professor Rauschenberg. "I own socks older than this kid," chortled the lanky Dr. Tubman. They gave Daniel a skeptical once-over as he made his way past them. When they assumed he was out of earshot, they continued. "Not quite up to Sir Alan Gardner," the one sniggered. "But let's hope he's not another Wallace Budge," the other guffawed. Although Daniel didn't think it was funny, he understood the obscure joke. Budge was a maddeningly dull lecturer, known for putting huge roomfuls of his colleagues to sleep with an avalanche of details. Once Daniel was settled at the podium, the air in the room was thick with tension. He was an unpredictable scholar, something his profession wasn't used to. He glanced at the ceiling for a second, just long enough for everyone to wonder what he was doing. Then he suddenly turned and shot a question to Professor Rauschenberger. "Sir, what kind of car do you drive?" Confused, the old fellow answered, "A Ford." "A Model T?" Daniel's question got a laugh. "I'm not quite that old. I drive an Escort." "I see." Daniel scratched his chin. "Power steering and power brakes?" he asked. "Don't forget the power windows," the old fellow said, trying to play along. "So, in the unlikely event that a long-dormant volcano erupts in Santa Monica this afternoon, and we're all exhumed hundreds of years later by wunderkind archaeologists, there's really no chance of them mistakenly dating you and your car to the early part of this century." "What are you driving at?" asked Rauschenberger's companion, Dr. Tubman. Indeed, no one in the audience had the slightest idea where Daniel was leading them. Henry Ford starts out modestly, almost primitively, with the old Tin Lizzie, the Model A. Then he slowly develops his product into the sophisticated technology we enjoy today, which leads to my central question about the ancient Egyptians. Why didn't their culture develop? I believe the evidence shows that their arts, sciences, mathematics, technology, techniques of warfare are all there, complete from the beginning. Daniel gave them a minute to mull and murmur, then went back on the attack. What I want to argue here today is that the Egyptians of the pre-Old Kingdom era somehow inherited all of these arts and sciences. Then, after a short getting acquainted period, we see the full flowering of what we call ancient Egypt. There was an audible clucking reaction in the audience. He pressed on. Their writing, for example, the hieroglyphic system of the first two dynasties, is notoriously difficult to interpret. The common wisdom holds that it is a crude version of the more complex writing we find later, at the time of the Old Kingdom. But what I have tried to demonstrate in a series of articles is that this early language is already a fully developed system, a combination of phonetic and ideogrammatic elements. If this is true, they were able to move from crude cave paintings to a complicated system for describing the world and themselves in virtually no time at all, a few generations. Daniel paused and watched quietly as the first group of scientists made their way to the exits. He wanted to argue that the old system was even more elegant than the later hieroglyphs, but since he was the only person who could read them fluently, he knew he'd be talking to the air. He changed the subject. Let's take another example. The theme of today's conference is Khufu's pyramid, he began. Dr. Jami coughed politely to catch Daniel's attention, then nodded. As if to say that is indeed the theme, please stick to it. The same argument applies to Khufu's pyramid. Most scientists believe that this masterpiece of engineering must have been the result of generations of practice. According to this theory, Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara, the so-called flat pyramid, and the large tombs at Abydos are seen as warm-ups, learning exercises that lead to the infinitely more complex and precise Khufu's pyramid. As many of you know, I don't subscribe to that theory. In my view, Khufu's pyramid must have come first, to be followed by the lesser structures just mentioned. The evidence supporting the traditional sequence of construction is based on folklore and written records that were made hundreds of years after the fact. The scant evidence we do have suggests, in my view, that the people living along the Nile were slowly forgetting how to build these structures, getting worse and worse at it with each passing generation. Another contingent of conferees stood up and walked out. Others were giggling audibly, but Daniel pressed on. He didn't have any other choice. Unfortunately, the many attempts to determine the construction dates of the pyramids using carbon C14 tests haven't given us conclusive results. Enough conflicting data exists to justify just about any theoretical position. But ask yourselves this question. All the lesser pyramids are heavily inscribed with the names of the pharaohs who ordered their construction. The mastabas surrounding the pyramids are blanketed with cartouches announcing the names and titles of their owners, lists of offerings, construction dates, which gods they worshipped, the musical instruments they played, etc. Typically, we find painted histories in these tombs, extolling the many godlike qualities of the person buried there. The pharaohs were the greatest egoists in the history of the world, and yet the greatest pyramid of them all, Khufu's, has no writing whatsoever. Not a mark anywhere, inside or out. Does that make any sense? An imposing older gentleman, Professor Romney of UC Berkeley, got to his feet and interrupted. It's an interesting theory, Dr. Jackson, one that most of us are familiar with. Someone in the crowd began humming the Twilight Zone theme, which cracked up some people and left others confused. Romney, a tall, gaunt man, was not distracted. He stared at Daniel and continued. You suggest the pyramid wasn't built for a pharaoh because there wasn't a name on it. But what about Vus's discovery of the quarryman's inscription of Khufu's name written inside the relieving chamber? Sealed since its construction? Daniel rolled his eyes. Oh, come on, that discovery was a joke, a big fraud perpetrated by Vus himself. Not only was that the wrong thing to say in front of this conservative crowd, it was definitely the wrong way to say it. The audience erupted into angry, vehement dissent. A few of the more boisterous even began to boo. Another score of professors stood up and left. Professor Romney made his voice heard over the shouting. "That's too easy, Dr. Jackson. If you had done your homework, you wouldn't have to defame the good reputation of dead men to support your ideas," he thundered. Up to that point, Daniel had maintained a certain ironic amusement with how badly things were going. That changed to a hostile, lethal precision in the bat of an eyelash. Before leaving for Egypt, he began, Vuz bragged that he would make an important discovery that would make him world famous. Using his father's money, he hired an elite team of experts and brought them to the Giza pyramids. But after several very expensive months, they had nothing to show for their troubles. So Vuz fired the lot of them and imported a gang of gold miners from his father's South American mining operation. Less than 3 weeks later, they discovered what 40 centuries of explorers, grave robbers, and scientists could not find: the secret room, sealed since construction. In this otherwise empty room, they found the thing that made Vuz's reputation, the long-sought-after cartouche with the name of Khufu. The cartouche appears on 3 walls of the chamber, but strangely, not on the wall Vuz sledgehammered into rubble to enter the room. The name is written in a red ink that appears nowhere else in ancient Egypt. It is astonishingly well preserved, and incredibly, it is misspelled. "Well, what can you expect from an illiterate quarryman?" Romney asked. By this point, Daniel had abandoned the podium and was stalking up and down the stage like a hungry circus tiger. He walked to a chalkboard and, with surprising speed, wrote out a series of hieroglyphs. "This is the symbol Vuz claimed to have found in the relieving chamber. Now we all know, if we've done our homework," he stared bullets at Romney, "that Vuz carried with him the 1906 edition of Wilkinson's Materia Hieroglyphica, published in Amsterdam by heinous books. Diligent students such as yourselves, Professor, will not have failed to notice that in the very next edition the publishers include a loose-leaf apology listing the errata in the previous edition. The listing includes the hieroglyphic for the name Khufu. They'd misprinted the first consonant of Khufu's name. It should have looked like this." Daniel drew an almost identical set of symbols vertically down the chalkboard. "What an exceedingly strange coincidence that the cartouche Vuz discovered is misspelled in the exact same way. If a quarryman had misspelled the name of the pharaoh, especially on his burial chamber, he would have been put to death and the wall would have been torn down and rebuilt." Daniel paused and gave the professor an ugly look, adding, "But I'm sure you knew all of this already because you look like a man who takes his homework seriously." These last words were delivered just as Professor Romney stormed from the conference hall. Before he left, he turned for one parting shot. "You sound like a bad television show or that Chariots of the Gods book." That brought a few chuckles and scattered applause. But Daniel could feel he had won back some of the audience. A few of the important names were still in the room, and now he hoped they were ready to listen. Now, if we could get back for a moment, perhaps the real origins of their civilization lay buried in the wadis of the Western Sahara. "Professor, may I?" At the very back of the room, in a smart, expensive dress and oversized glasses, stood a woman who looked to be about 60 years of age. In fact, she was much older. "Let me say first," she said with a faint accent, "that your command of the facts is impressive. I have just one question. Who do you think built the pyramids?" This was the question Daniel had hoped to avoid. No matter what his answer, ridicule would surely follow. Daniel had learned over and over again that when it came to matters of Egyptian history, the academic community behaved like religious zealots. It was as though all previously accepted theories were sacrosanct, written in stone by the great Almighty. All those who challenged these findings condemned as heretic. Daniel had hoped that he could stimulate a diatribe with his colleagues in the audience and re-examine this period with an open mind, acknowledging that there are still so many unanswered questions about the very nature of the origins of Egyptian culture. But the moment the question was asked, Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before the symposium would disintegrate into another humiliating experience. Reluctantly, Daniel stammered an answer. That's the whole point, he told her. I have no idea who built them or why. A collective groan of disappointment went up in the lecture hall. The stylish, elderly woman nodded briskly, as if she were satisfied with that answer before she turned and left. A heavy-set bearded man in a tight shirt called out a suggestion in a mock English accent. "The lost people of Atlantis?" Those people still in the audience laughed and then began gathering up their belongings. "Or Martians, perhaps?" "I didn't say that," Daniel defended himself. "No, but you were about to," the bearded man retorted. "You're missing the point entirely," he said into his notes. The atmosphere in the room was about as intellectual as a school cafeteria during a mass food fight. More than half the audience was gone, and more were leaving. Fishing through his pile of documents, Daniel found the report he wanted, and vainly attempted to continue, speaking into the microphone without looking up. New geological evidence dates the Sphinx back to a much earlier period. Knowing this to be true, we must begin to reevaluate everything we've come to accept about the origins of Egyptian culture. We simply have to start from scratch. When the door closed behind the last laughing group of conferees, Dr. Ajami, who was still sitting patiently on the podium, approached Daniel. His mood was plain. "I'm very disappointed with you, Daniel. I thought we had an understanding that you wouldn't discuss this nonsense here today. I took a risk presenting you here today, tried to do you a favor, but now I'm afraid you've killed your career. Goodbye." Then Jami joined the others in the lobby. Daniel, his hands beginning to tremble, his face hot with humiliation, stared out at the vacant auditorium, before quietly closing his notebook and leaning to the microphone. "Are there any questions?" As Daniel sat in the rain, watching the ink on his phone bill start to run, he thought about the old woman at the back of the auditorium again. How he'd like to chat with her over a nice cup of tea and then strangle her to death. She had breezed into the room just when he turned the tide, and had asked him the exact question he was trying to avoid. At length, he stood and made his way upstairs to his apartment, where he met with yet another unwelcome surprise. His front door was standing wide open. "Burglars," he whispered. Normally, he would have run away and let them take whatever they wanted, but not today. Sopping wet, he slipped in the door and found the umbrella he had set by the door so he wouldn't forget it. Normally a real peacenik, Daniel stalked down the entry hall, poised for a fight. Edging around the corner, he could see one of them going through his desk. Leaping into his front room, umbrella at attack position, Daniel found himself face to face with the same elderly woman from the conference. She looked up for a moment, then went back about her business, nonchalantly leafing through the papers on his disorganized desk. "Come in," she said with the trace of an accent. Her voice was calm, professional. "Your cleaning lady must be taking the year off," she said without much of a grin. For the second time today, this woman was confusing him to the point of semi-speechlessness. Gathering his wits and relaxing his death grip on the parasol, he formulated his question. Is there some... What the hell are you doing in my apartment?" "Now this is truly a beautiful piece of art," she said, picking up the graceful sculpture of an Egyptian woman that Daniel kept above his desk. The marble bust, with traces of its original paint, showed the delicate and very beautiful face of a young woman. "I'd guess 14th century BC, probably from the area around Edfu." She glanced around at the second-hand and third-hand furniture before asking, "How did you ever manage to afford it?" "Please be careful with that," he said nervously. Daniel didn't want to discuss how the treasure had come into his possession. Yes, it was his only expensive possession, but it was far more valuable to him than any price it could fetch in dollars. His visitor, sensing how concerned he was, set it back carefully on the special shelf above the cluttered desk. Daniel finally placed her accent. It was Swedish, but was now so slight that he guessed she'd been living in the States for most of her life. Everything about this woman spoke of power, privilege, and complete self-confidence. Only the inch-thick lenses of her glasses, which magnified her eyes to the size of half-dollars, disrupted the effect. She peered through them now at Daniel. "I've come to offer you a job." "A job?" His mind started to race. What kind of job? Strolling over to a framed snapshot on the wall, she changed the subject once again. "Your parents?" "Foster." "Oh, that's right. Your parents died in that plane crash back in, what was it, 73? Yes, let me think." Daniel broke into a savage imitation of the old woman. "Yes, I believe it was 73. An excellent year for a fiery death, wouldn't you say?" The woman realized she'd made a hurtful mistake and apologized, but Daniel didn't let her off that easily. "No, really, if it would amuse you, let's definitely have a chit-chat about the way my parents died." When Daniel was finished, he walked past her into his small kitchen for something to drink. He stared into the wasteland of his refrigerator until the woman continued. "My name is Catherine Langford, and I have some very early hieroglyphics I'd like you to work on." "Since when is the military interested in hieroglyphs?" Catherine stopped talking and feigned confusion. "Military? What makes you think this has anything to do with the military?" Daniel was guessing. He figured she must have flashed some sort of badge or credential to get his suspicious landlord Vladimir to open the apartment. And that chauffeur across the street was sporting a military-style crew cut, an oddity on the streets of Hollywood. The way she avoided his question answered it for him. "I think I'm too old to run off and join the army," Daniel told her. Catherine was delighted with how quick and observant he was. "Very impressive, Doctor. Look, I wish I could explain everything to you, but there's a certain amount of secrecy involved with this project." "Well, maybe you can divulge this much. Why should I take a job I know nothing about?" "You have no family or friends here in the city. Your landlord mentioned that he'd served you an eviction notice because of your rent being overdue, and there's a stack of unpaid bills on your desk. Now it looks to me like young Dr. Jackson needs a job, and after your speech this afternoon, I wouldn't sit home waiting for the phone to ring." Daniel didn't know what to say. Those were pretty good reasons to take whatever job she was offering. "But there's an even better reason you should come to work for me, Daniel." This woman had a lot of nerve. "And what might that be?" he asked. "To prove that your theories are right." She unclasped her smart little handbag and took out a set of old black-and-white photos. Holding them out for him to inspect, the pictures offered glimpses of the large cover stone the Langford expedition had found near Giza. There was no indication of the large ring they'd found beneath, or the fossils. As Daniel flipped through the pictures, all the muscles in his face went slack. The expression, which Catherine had seen before, told her that she just hired the newest member of her team. "Enough." She snatched the faded exposures away from him, handing him another envelope in return. "What's this?" "Your travel plans," Catherine explained, preparing to go. Daniel opened the envelope, took one look at the plane ticket, and sneezed. "Denver? Look, as you can imagine, I'm not real big on flying." "Get over it," she said deadpan. Then with a smile, she pulled the door closed behind her. Chapter 4. Yuma, Arizona. The unmarked sedan coasted to a stop in front of a modestly landscaped two-bedroom house in the suburbs of Yuma, Arizona. Although it was almost winter, the noon sun made the streets an oven, forcing the souls who lived there to hide in their air-conditioned interiors. Even the dogs, lolling tongues out in the shade, were too hot to come and bark. The old joke applied that day, the one about the guy from Yuma who dies and goes to hell. When he gets there, he goes home for his blanket. Doors clicked open, and 2 officers from the nearby Marine Corps air station stepped into the heat. Their crisp uniforms announced they were both commissioned officers out on official business. While the first officer stepped onto the porch and knocked at the door, the other, carrying a thick black folder, surveyed the garage. Evidence of happier times. A basketball rim above the open garage door. Bikes parked at attention. The front door opened, but the door chain was still latched. Through the crack, an attractive woman about 40 years old peered out at the men. She knew this moment would come. She'd spent the last 2 years fearing this moment and wishing it would come at the same time. Now they were here, and she hated them. It meant she had lost the battle for her husband's life. "Mrs. O'Neill?" asked the first officer. The door slammed closed. The officers looked at one another and were about to knock again when it swung back open. Sarah O'Neill, still in her housecoat, her hair matted from sleep, scrutinized the officers coldly. Years of working as a schoolteacher had taught her how to freeze boys in their tracks, no matter how old or how innocent they might be. But a moment later, her fierce expression began to melt into one of pain. "Wipe your feet," she said, then disappeared around the corner into the kitchen. The soldiers obeyed her orders, then came into the house. The living room, decorated almost exclusively in white, was a shrine to tidiness. Unfortunately, it did not contain what the men were looking for. "Mrs. O'Neill, is your husband at home?" asked the first officer. From the kitchen, the sound of something being sliced on a chopping block could be heard. "Yes, he is," she answered. After another uncomfortable moment, he asked the empty room, "Ma'am, do you think we might be able to speak with him?" "You can try. Last door, end of the hall," she said, and continued her cutting. Moving through the living room, they passed a mantel full of carefully arranged photos, each one in a frame. The younger officer picked one of them up. A dozen people at a backyard pool party making goofy faces into the camera. The stark contrast between the explosion of life in the picture and the absence of it in the room was spooky. The soldier carefully replaced the frame and went on. At the end of the hall, the pair found an open door leading into another orderly room. This one belonged to a teenage boy, judging from the sports trophies and the big pool skating poster. Here the officers found what they were looking for. Sitting in an armchair, staring through the window at his own backyard, was a barefoot, shirtless, unshaven man wearing only a pair of blue jeans. His greasy hair was down to his collar. A few moments earlier, he had been holding a pistol, rolling it over in his hands, practicing pointing it at his head, wishing he could pull the trigger. The moment he heard their voices in the living room, he'd leaned forward and stashed the gun in the top drawer of the desk. Walking into the room, the younger officer smirked before he could stop himself. During the drive from the base, his partner had recited a dozen or so stories about how deadly and skillful O'Neill had been before all the trouble. But then this long-haired, out-of-shape, watery-eyed dude who looked like he was strung out on drugs. What sort of classified military communique could possibly be going to this burned-out building of a man? The officer with the folder quickly stepped forward. "Pardon us, Colonel O'Neill. We're from General West's office." After a long pause, the man in the chair turned his head to look at them. His eyes were so lifeless, he didn't seem to understand who had entered the room. The older officer thought it best to repeat himself. "General West sent us here, sir." With a slow, empty gesture, he motioned for them to sit down and get on with it. Sarah walked into the hallway and noticed that they hadn't closed the door. She took a deep breath and moved to the hall closet, pretending to look for something. She heard her husband talking. Years old, so you aren't even sure if this threat still exists. As I told you, sir, everything we know about it is included in this briefing statement. O'Neill was getting increasingly annoyed with these two. They were from the same office that had run him out of the service in the first place. Aren't you guys still worried that I'm unstable? Haven't you read my discharge papers? The older officer hesitated for a moment before deciding to put his cards on the table. He leaned forward to emphasize how serious he was. He wasn't sure how O'Neill would react to what he was going to say next. I don't think you understand, sir. We don't want you for this project in spite of your condition. We want you because of it. That stopped O'Neill in his tracks. He couldn't believe the incredible arrogance it took to walk into his home, knowing the shape he was in, then inform him, almost matter-of-factly, that they wanted to take advantage of his weakness. He was stunned. He looked up toward the doorway and saw Sarah standing there, trying to act as if she weren't listening. But she was listening, and now she was suddenly very afraid. She turned her head just enough to make eye contact with her husband. But as quickly as she did, the younger officer was on his feet and pushed the door closed with a sharp click. As soon as she was alone in the hallway, everything came flooding in at once. She was sure the two men had come to offer Jack some sort of kamikaze mission. The more dangerous the mission she knew, the more likely he was to accept it. And because of his skill at creating accidents, she would never see him again. She began imagining the last horrible chapter of their marriage, her sitting at home waiting for the phone to ring so some junior officer with a soothing voice could tell her that Jack had been killed. She closed the closet, then wandered back into the living room, pausing to straighten the picture on the mantel. She sat on the couch and looked calmly around the room, allowing herself to wonder for the first time whether it wouldn't be better if he went. She knew that's what he wanted. She'd put up a good fight to save him, but perhaps it was time to admit defeat and let go. The familiar dull ache rose up in her chest, the feeling her heart gave her when it was about to break again. 20 minutes later, Sarah spied out her kitchen curtains as the officers returned to their car, minus the folders she'd seen them bring in. When they had driven away, she walked through the living room to the back of the house, where she heard the shower running. She opened the bedroom door and saw something that brought tears to her eyes almost instantly. Laid across the bedspread was her husband's neatly pressed uniform. Next to it was the black folder the men had delivered.